Welcome to the Profitable Farmer podcast, where we share stories and tips to help you run a better farming business and create your very own freedom farm. If you're looking to work smarter and not harder in your farm business, welcome. You're in the right place. G'day guys, and welcome once again to Profitable Farmer. I just get so excited at the start of each of these podcasts, especially when I get to interview incredible people like I get to in this one. 2 episodes ago, I shared my backstory and my take on resilience, and then interviewed our wellbeing and head coach in Tracy Seacombe to get her spin on resilience and how families can turn up better to each other to support each other in farm businesses to be more resilient. Now, about 6 weeks ago, our alumni at FOA was so lucky to have Maria Ruberto speak at one of our conferences and one of our dinners. And Maria was speaking between entree and main course in a beautiful restaurant to 110 farmers, which was a tough gig, but gosh, Maria absolutely held the audience incredibly and provided us not just with a compelling keynote, but just such an insightful spin and view, research-backed, on the neuroscience and the deep psychology that underpins resilience. And so I know our alumni members were just blown away with what we spoke of, Maria, and the feedback we've had since has been incredible. And it gives me just huge pleasure to be able to share your 30 years of clinical psychology experience, but just more than that, your deep passion for this topic and wanting to help individuals and high-performing teams to understand how they can engage each other better, perform better, and explore how to be more resilient in how they go about what they do. Welcome to Profitable Farmer, and thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, Jeremy, and thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak with you. I'm as excited as I am nervous, so I'm really keen to try and answer as many questions as I can, but really excited about the possibility of opening up this discussion around resilience and what it is and how people are currently talking about it.
Now, Maria, you've got a deep and extended background and connection to agriculture. Would you mind just sharing that connection?
Jeremy, I've waited 30 years to try and understand where this work is really needing to take me. And the first sort of 10 years of my life, next year it will be my 0 year, which is my 30th year in my trade as a psychologist. And I keep saying to everyone, I'm going to be wearing a party hat on every Zoom meeting next year. I'm going to take advantage of it. But I got to Farm Owners Academy and not knowing what to expect. And it was really interesting that as I sat there listening, I had this overwhelming experience that, oh my God, I know these people. And the reason why I know these people is because that's my ancestry. So both my parents have come from agriculture in Italy. And so they were they were migrants and I was first generation. And I couldn't speak a word of English when I started school. I was just Italian. That was just how it was. But I grew up in a home in urban area with a huge backyard, and we only ate what we grew. And if we had to buy anything additional, it would be from the market. And I remember my mum coming, I don't know whether you remember the old shopping bags that were nets. They were nets. And she would have two big shopping bags on either side, the nets, yeah, with live chickens with their heads sticking out. And that's how we'd get on the tram. And these chickens would just, she wouldn't batter an eyelid. And then in the other bag, and See, the thing is, Jeremy, when I tell this, if I was to tell this story to anyone else, they wouldn't believe me. But in the other bag, she had eels, but they were live eels because, of course, why would you buy the already killed eels? Because and so we would go home and she had an area in the back and my dad had this drum and this sort of fire pit, which now is, you pay thousands of dollars for, and back then, you just built your own, where they would kill the chickens and then they would scold them and, pluck all the, and the eels, she had this sort of a concrete sort of well outside, well, not a well, a concrete basin, huge basin. And she would fill it with water and stick the eels in and then put sort of an old metal thing over the top so they would, just to keep them alive until she was ready. Yeah, that's how it was, because you couldn't kill it and then leave it. You'd had to kill it, skin it, and then cook it quickly. So, I remember vegetation in the garden. I remember these live animals, and there were no pets. If there was a rabbit, you'd have it for dinner. So you couldn't even name it. It wasn't even. So that's where I've come from. And of course, all of the stories growing up was about, my parents living off farmland. And I came to the Farm Owners Academy and I just went, oh my gosh, I've got this feeling of belonging. And it was incredibly special.
Yeah, it's perfect. I think often we can forget about the deep backstories that so many of us have. Australian agriculture is actually really quite young, but to hear that memory that you have about farming with your family in Italy only relatively recently, it's quite amazing to hear.
Oh, it's incredible. And the stories that came from that, the stories about resilience, around determination, around belief, around hope, all of those stories that had come from the land because they were so connected with it, and that's where their livelihood was. The lessons that were learned from that, we are still learning that today, and many of us for the wider community still have that to learn. So there's something to be said about when we are so connected to land. And our Indigenous communities are the same. But when we are so connected to land, we have a very different relationship with it, and the relationship is one of sturdiness, and it is one of respect, and it's about how we respect ourselves and how we respect the work that we do and the land that we're on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Maria, what's your connection with resilience, and then perhaps as a trained and highly experienced psychologist and being so well researched in neuroscience, what's the definition of it? So your deep connection with it first, and then maybe the more formal definition of it.
Look, it's been really interesting, Jeremy, because in my early years, a lot of my work as a psychologist, as people would know, psychiatry is the same, is that our task is to assess for deficit. Our task is to be able to look at lifestyles or people's patterns of life and look at it and go, well, what's wrong? What's not going right? How do we assess it? How do we diagnose it? And now how do we fix it? And that has been very much the paradigm with which psychology has been working for many, many years. Probably until about sort of 15 years ago or so, when there started to be a change, and I certainly saw this in my work. If we are to grow and if we are to develop better coping mechanisms, and if we are to expand our capacities as humans, that's not going to happen in the deficit. You're not going to get higher order thinking under depression. You're not going to get higher order thinking under anxiety. You're not going to get creative thinking under those really heavy mood states, because those neurological states don't lend themselves to higher order thinking, problem solving, in-depth insight, being able to reflect is actually a really heightened, you require a heightened neurological state to do that. And so when I think about resilience, And what it's meant for me is that it really has changed the entire way that I practice psychology. And, I was listening to your podcast, and you said you said a lot of things that I wished that I was sitting beside you. I felt like your wing woman. I've watched Maverick. I've gone, I went to the cinemas, and as you were talking, I felt like a wing woman, and I felt like turning and going, yeah, that's right. And yes. And you spoke about, we need to be really careful about our belief systems in ourselves, and we need to be careful about how we describe ourselves, because if I say to myself, I have anxiety or I am depressed, it really does impact the way that we open ourselves up to intervention. And what we do know is that our minds are incredibly powerful, and our minds are only as powerful as the health of our brain allows it to be. And so suddenly we've got this really complex sort of state of saying, well, we need to be healthy, and we need to have a healthy body and so that it looks after our brain, and we need to have a healthy brain so that our thinking can also reflect that level of health and fitness. And so resilience for me, or well-being for me, is very much about adopting a strengths-based approach. And a strengths-based approach is not denying that people experience anxiety or they experience states of depression, because I first of all, it's foolish, and second of all, it's unhelpful. But I do think that, and as you were saying in the previous podcast, we all experience states of depression. We all experience states of anxiety, because it is normal to do that. To live a normal human life, you need to live the entire spectrum of mood states and emotion. It becomes problematic when we get stuck in a particular state that then does not serve us, or that is no longer responsive to our environment, and we call that being adaptive. Mm. And so one of the things that we know about resilience is that when we do cultivate it, when we do grow it, when we do build it, not only do we find ourselves making different choices and adopting diverse mind states, but the way that our brain operates is vastly different. The way that our brain uses blood flow is vastly different. The way that our brain connects to every other part of the brain is vastly different. So, under states of distress, you get very focused, very narrow activation in the brain in only certain states that allow us to move into states of defense. And under those states, we cannot optimize, but we can protect. And so it's important to be able to do that in times. However, that is not where our growth or our recovery sits. Our growth and recovery really sits in the area of understanding what well-being is. And what is it? What does it look like? What is it that we need to employ in order to be able to do those, to be able to do those things, move into those states. And it was really interesting because, another thing that you talked about, so I've got to tell you, when I was listening to your podcast, I had my earpods on, and I was walking the dog down our local creek. I live in Strathmore, for those Victorians, and we've got Moonee Ponds Creek down behind us, just next to the school. And it's just the most beautiful path to take next to the creek. And there's lots of, it's full of shrubs and full of trees, and it's been kept, as much as possible to its original state. And as I was walking, I was listening to you talk about how your mindset as a young child was one of deficit, and that your negative comparison to those men around you who were bigger and better and broader and more capable, and you compared yourself and you've just gone, well, I'm not that, and I'm clumsy, and I trip over myself, and and all the rest of it. And I remember, and as I'm listening to you, I'm feeling really sad, because a lot of that was a lot of my upbringing too, where I was the last, but my parents didn't speak a word of English. And So I didn't feel like I really fit anywhere. But I remember being the last and being the less interesting, the less valued, simply because I was such a child and my sister was 10 years older than me. But it's really interesting how quickly we assess our environment and form a belief without really checking it out with anybody. And we can hold those belief systems for a very, very long time, and they really lead and dominate us. And so resilience is very much about stopping and checking in, stopping and checking in with other people and having conversations. So communication becomes key in order for us, and honesty becomes key in order for us to just open up our understanding.
Thank you. I'm so excited to go a bit deeper into this now and to look at, I guess, the more formal and research-based information that is about that supporting the work you do in resilience. Just before we do, I do want to acknowledge that this conversation might challenge some of our listeners, and in the written introduction to this podcast, we're going to include some numbers that you can call if, in listening to this, you feel like you need extra support. But just on that, Maria, what are some of the warnings, so to speak, for our listeners so that they can be prepared for the conversation we're about to step into?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. That's really important. Look, when we begin to talk about resilience, we can't talk about resilience, well, you can, but if we're going to talk about it deeply, to talk about resilience well, we also need to be talking about mental ill health. And when we talk about mental ill health, like depression and anxiety and bipolar and, affective mood disorder and, obsessive compulsive disorder and eating disorders, we need to be very mindful that there are people who may be listening to this podcast who may fall into those categories. And so what we ask is that if you are listening and if you are hearing things that may trigger you or that may cause discomfort or that may cause you to have a sense of overwhelm or have just feel a bit dissociated or maybe even feel a little bit annoyed or angry, know that it's a very normal response and it's a very common response to hearing about emotional and psychological states that may not be as functional as we'd like. So for those people who are listening, we do hope that you continue right through because there will be a lot of information today, but please hold yourselves in care. Hand on your heart, hand on your tummy. Be present, be kind to yourself, and know that with any information that causes discomfort, there is also information that can offer you possibilities. And so holding yourself in care really means to be thinking about how you're feeling. If you need to switch off and go and get a drink of water, cup of tea, go to the toilet, and then come back, and maybe you won't listen to the podcast all in one hit, but you might listen to it in bits. And those bits are great. Take the time that you need to go and ground yourself. Go and, sit next to your partner. Go and walk with the dog for a bit. Go outside and, check whatever it is that you're checking. The cabbage. The walk with the sheep. Whatever it is that you're doing, and then come back. So, but if you are feeling quite overwhelmed, then there will be phone numbers that you can call, and please do reach out and do call and do speak to somebody because those services are there and they are there for you.
Perfect. Maria, thank you. So then launching in and just to create a context for this conversation, I want to ask, how big is this as a problem in community? You shared some pretty alarming stats with us that I might ask you to speak to again. How big an issue is this for us?
Look, Jeremy, the issue is a significant one. And I don't like to hold a position of being an alarmist because I don't think that that's helpful to anybody. But if we just very quickly have a look at what our statistics are telling us, is that from the 2019 Productivity Commission, so if we go back to prior COVID, which I think is important, one in three people a day, 3 people a day die by road trauma. Yeah, we lose 3 people in Australia, 3 people a day to road trauma. We lose 8 people a day to suicide.
Mm.
Now, those statistics are significant, and that was pre-COVID. 1 in 4 people in 2019 were living with a mental illness and, suffering mental ill health. And those rates are very high. When we have a look at post-COVID, the rates of people who are living with symptoms that warrant a diagnosis is 2 in 5. And with all of the information that we have, Jeremy, and with all of the on-site platforms that we can go to, with all of the help that's out there, we really need to be asking the question, why are we not getting better? Why are things getting worse? And they're not worse all the time, but what we've seen and what certainly we've learned over the last couple of years, and there's been some fantastic research that's come out of the World Health Organization and that's come out of some of our leading educational institutions around the world, is that we need to be really careful about how we use our attention. What are we paying attention to? Where how much time do we spend listening to particular information that may catastrophize or exasperate, or that may magnify everything that's going wrong? Now, that's not to say that things aren't going wrong. Of course they are, because life is like that. There are things that go right, things that go wrong, and things that just go. But we have a lot to learn in terms of how we use our capacity to attend to information. And our attention is a really lovely definition, is just simply where we choose to focus on at any one point in time. And even though that definition sounds so simple, when you think about, if you were to track your attention during the day and what it is that you are paying attention to, you start to realize very quickly that you have a pattern. You have a pattern, I have a pattern of things that we focus on. Where do we choose to focus our attention at any one point in time? And what's really interesting about this, Jeremy, is that, again, when I was walking along the river with my dog, Tonka, who's a Samoyed, love him to death, and as he's running along and barking, and I've got you in my ears, and you said that there is a part of the brain called the reticular activating system. And of course, you're a farmer and I'm a psychologist, and I'm walking along and you've said the word reticular activating system, and I've stopped and I've gone and I've looked around and I've gone, he said reticular activating system. And the dog's run ahead of me and I've stopped and I've looked around. Of course, there's no one around, but I needed to share it with someone because I've gone, you've actually focused on a part of the brain that is a very old part of the brain, and it sits in our brain stem. And it's sort of the width of a pencil. It's sort of long, and it sort of sits and connects our brain stem. And then it links to the middle part of our brain, which is called the thalamus. Now, the reticular activating system is a really interesting, it sort of helps regulate sleep and focus and awareness. But the way that I like to talk about the reticular activating system is that it's a little bit like an aperture of a camera. So when the aperture of a camera is wide open, so you imagine that the aperture of a camera, it closes and then it opens, and then, have you got the image where you've got those flaps that all sort of interlink?
Yep.
So when they close, that's when you can focus and you go, right, I'm focusing on just one task, and your aperture closes. And so your reticular activating system is giving you information that's coming in just via that little narrow aperture. Now, when there are lots of things happening in our environment, our reticular activating system, and this is just a metaphor, opens up. The aperture opens up, and suddenly you've got all of this information coming in. Now, when we are in states of anxiety, our aperture is open. Everything comes flooding in. And so what that does is that it overwhelms us. And what we haven't done is that we actually haven't trained our aperture to close or narrow or open. We haven't trained it to be flexible. And so it becomes rigid. It's either open or it's almost closed shut. And closing shut is when I've got nothing coming in because I'm lying in bed, I've got my covers over me, I don't want to listen to anything, and I'm retreating. But what's really interesting is that the reticular activating system is linked to the thalamus, and the thalamus, again, is part of the middle part of the brain. And, all of this we do training in our resilience first aid, but we'll talk about that later on, but is linked to our middle, and the thalamus is like a router. It takes all of the information from the reticular activating system and additional information that comes in from our internal state. So all of our senses, what's coming in from all of our senses, and the two of them work really well. But the thalamus then holds it all, and it routes it, because then it's got to give it back out. Yeah, so it sort of turns to the reticular activating system and says, "Okay, give me what you've got. I'm going to hold it for a minute. I'm going to see what else is coming in, and now depending on the information that I've got, I then need to give it to either what we call our task positive. So our executive systems, which are our cortex that sit on, the squiggly bit of the brain that sit on the outside. So our prefrontal, our, parietal, our precuneus at the back. So there's a whole lot of systems, areas that are networked to produce higher order thinking. Now, those networks can't work their best if you've got an aperture that's constantly open, where you've got all this information that comes flooding in. It floods the thalamus, and the thalamus just goes, "Oh, well, now we've got to panic." So rather than doing something with that information, because you need to be calm to do that, your middle brain, this limbic area, goes into a panic and it hits the amygdala. Now, I want to talk about the amygdala for a little bit, because the amygdala has been notoriously known for a long time to be the threat center of the brain. And certainly there's a part of, so the amygdala is a tiny organelle, but it has sections in it. Think about when you are, you've just killed a livestock, and you've hung it, and you've gone, now you need to cut it up into bits. Because I remember my dad doing this with pork. Yeah, we're Italian, we're a big pork family, and so he would hang it up, and there would be nothing that you would ever leave from that pork. You would eat everything, everything. Yeah, but I remember him, because he was very good. He would start to carve it, and he'd carve it in bits, and there was that bit, and there was this bit, and there was this bit, and there was, and you do bits. The amygdala is the same. It's in bits. There's a bit of the amygdala that is really sensitive to threat and is really sensitive to adversity. And so that goes into an alarm state, and it does that very quickly when the thalamus is loaded with all of this information that feels so overwhelming. And then that part of the amygdala just takes over the rest of it, or the rest of its parts, and it dominates. But the amygdala, over the last few years, we've seen some really amazing research where we now know that the amygdala is really important in processing all information or all emotion, not just the harsh ones. And so our job is to train this amygdala to shine rather than shout. When our amygdala is shouting at us, we become reactive, we go into this fight or flight state. But when our amygdala shines for us rather than shouts at us, so this idea of our amygdala shining rather than shouting is quite prominent at the moment. So if it shines for us, what it does is that it just processes all of the initial emotion that comes in, and it's able to hold it better because it's also connected to another part called the hippocampus. But that's probably a conversation for another time, because I wish I had diagrams to show you. But the point is this, the point is that our brain is so complex. And because of its complexity, and, you know, Jeremy, the reality is we don't even know half of it yet. You know, there are parts of the brain that work that we actually don't know how and why. You know, we've got really good guesses at the moment. But one way of thinking about the brain is how well does it connect to all of its areas? Because when there is a disconnect, then we find that we are less resilient. But where the brain is really well connected to all of its parts, then you've got really, really big connection. So the idea about training this reticular activating system goes back to attention. So when we're able to train our aperture to open and close, and that it's becoming more adaptive to what our needs are and also what the environment is telling us. So when we've got that flexibility, you know, when you can open the shutter, close the shutter, open it, close it a little bit more. When we can do that flexibly and we can train in that, that's where we've got, again, high level of resilience. Now, that's only one area, but that's training our attention. So you're absolutely on the money.
I love how much we are learning about how our mind works, and now there's so much well-researched science and neuroscience supporting a lot of the personal development and self-improvement principles that we teach as coaches. I'd love to explore this further with you, and let's go deeper into how the mind works. When I'm stressed and under pressure, and my amygdala fires and I am in fight or flight, I understand that that's the amygdala trying to keep me safe. But would you mind speaking about how we behave in that moment and how that might not serve us necessarily if we're not actually in a life or death situation? And then even how to self-regulate and manage that fight or flight condition?
Yeah. It's a really big question. So let's break it up a little bit. So when the amygdala is firing and it's shouting at us, that shout becomes really loud. So in our head, because it's so loud, we believe what we think. And so under threat, under adversity, under challenge, because the amygdala shouts, this is just a metaphor that we use because there's a whole lot of other stuff that's happening.
It's perfect.
Because of the shouting, it actually draws itself a lot of attention, the amygdala. And what it does is that it draws a lot of the resources from the brain. So rather than the resources going to all of our great thinking areas, it draws it away and it keeps it all for itself because it's got a big job to do because it's shouting, yeah? So when it shouts things like, you're an idiot, you're stupid, don't do that, don't trust them, that's not okay. So the amygdala likes small, short statements. The smaller the statements, the more the amygdala is shouting. So the amygdala will shout, idiot, other colourful language, yeah? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the shorter your statement, the more your amygdala is shouting. So that's actually a bit of that's a flag for us. So if we're thinking in really, really short 2 or 3 word statements and they are loud, know that we are not in a good thinking space. And what we would normally see that we become reactive. Now, we become reactive because the amygdala is shouting, but when the amygdala shouts, it actually releases a whole lot of hormone into our system, into our endocrine system. And adrenaline is one of them. And there are a whole lot of others. But if we just talk about adrenaline at the moment, adrenaline is a really powerful hormone. And its job is to mobilize. It's a mobilizer. So when we are in a state where the amygdala is shouting at us, and then it dumps a whole lot of adrenaline into our system just through the HPA axis, and what happens is that we've got all of this body energy, this muscular energy. So we're more likely to throw things. We're more likely to use really aggressive language, not because we're bad people, but because we have this really strong mobilization effect to act out because we've got all this energy. And so we're most likely to slam the door. We're most likely to get into the car and speed off. We're most likely to behave in ways that are really reactive and engage in heightened energetic behaviours, which we know to be aggression. And after that subsides, we walk away feeling so terrible about ourselves, feeling so shamed or guilty that we've behaved in ways that we actually didn't want, or in ways that don't align with our values. And then we sort of develop this belief system that that's who we are. Well, no, that's not right. It's just that we haven't trained this very old part of the brain, this system, this, primitive part of the brain. We haven't trained it, and we haven't learnt the skills. And so we are more likely to lean into that.
So how often and for what duration can people in a farming or even an intense professional environment, and I think about surgeons and architects and engineers and others, how much time in a day might people spend in that state?
Oh, Jeremy, that's a really big question, because if the more we keep to ourselves and the more we close ourselves off in our head and just listen to what's going on in here, the more we believe what we think. And this sort of phenomenon of believing what we're thinking is just part of the human condition. Because I hear myself speak and I hear myself think, that's incredibly intimate. I keep saying to people, there are two things that are so intimate to us in our lives. The first one is our thinking, and the second one are our emotions. Nothing will be ever more intimate to us than how we feel in our bodies and how we think in our head. And because we are so aligned, then we believe what we think. And I do say to people, we need to understand that this is a really powerful state, because people will die for an idea. If we develop belief systems where we believe that moving toward a point of death is in some way optimizing, and if we truly believe that, then we will act that out. And so this idea that our thinking creates emotions and our emotions become so loud within us that we act them out. So the more we stay in our head, and, you ask how long can we stay in there for? We can be in there for days, weeks, where we're just looping and looping and looping and giving ourselves, and we build a narrative. It's like what you were saying in the podcast. You spent years as a kid going through primary school and then secondary school and then uni, and then, you've got, the great job in Sydney, and you go and you spent years of this, giving yourself this narrative, this story. So if we're talking about really heightened levels or spiking levels of anxiety or spiking levels of aggression, we could be in there for minutes and hours. But if we then bring that down a little bit, but continue to tell ourselves the same story, we act that out in our lives. We take less risks. We make less decisions that are helpful. So the Are You OK Day that you spoke about in your podcast, the reason why that has to be so pivotal in our lives is because the minute that you go to someone and you go, hey, what's going on for you? You become a circuit breaker to somebody's spinning head. And the minute that you ask, how are you? And that we allow those conversations to happen, the minute we start to say things out loud, and the second that I say things out loud, I actually hear what I think. And when you hear it externally, it sounds very, very different to when you hear it internally. And so the idea of getting people to talk is absolutely fundamental. It is fundamental in the way that we can support each other, but also give feedback. You know, one of the things you were talking about was learning about your cognitive distortions. And I love that. I think cognitive distortions should be placed in cow's milk for all those dairy farmers, and it should be sold on the shelf as full cream milk with cognitive flexibility.
If only.
Because when you teach cognitive distortions, what you're doing, and this is so foundational, what you are doing is that you are giving people a way of being able to detect whether their thinking is helpful or unhelpful. That's it.
Yep.
If I've got unhelpful thinking, don't follow it. But if I've got helpful thinking, I can follow it. But how do you know what's helpful and what's unhelpful if you're so connected to what you think? And so cognitive distortions actually give you the skill to be able to delineate, differentiate between what's helpful and what's not helpful. And there are many cognitive distortions. And, you know, people use different names for different cognitive distortions. But they are, I think, so fundamental that we should be teaching this, and we do, by the way, but we should be teaching this in primary school. We should be teaching it as a foundational skill, because if you've got that really early on, that becomes an inoculation of early onset depression, early onset anxiety.
Yeah. And to your point, I think we need to do another podcast on those cognitive distortions. And, you know, to answer my own question, perhaps, I cannot explain how completely debilitating being in that mindset was for those first 24 years of my life. And I came out of a wonderfully fortunate and privileged family and lifestyle, yet that was what I picked up and that was my psychology. So, you know, I completely get how the loop can be damaging. And I also reflect on how lucky I am to learn that at such a young age and how much it has served me since. I guess with this, when the amygdala fires, and what you've talked about is we kind of can go into fight or flight, and that takes up a lot of our mental resources so that it shuts down the parts of our brain like the prefrontal cortex that supports higher order thinking. How do we what can we do to self-regulate, to quieten the amygdala, and then over time even train the amygdala so that very few situations require a fight or flight response? Yet that's, as you say, that's what plays out. That's that old mind reality. How do we manage our amygdala and then give ourselves the ability to re-engage that higher order thinking? I think it's the prefrontal cortex, so that we can come back into a place of critical thinking, creative thinking, problem solving without the intensity that the amygdala can bring.
Okay, so I want to give you an image. You know that image that Michelangelo painted in the Sistine Chapel, where man has his finger out, and then you know, God's got his finger out, and they're just about touching? I want you to go to that image, because the idea is that God's image is, you know, his finger is our prefrontal cortex. That's where the higher order thinking is. Yeah, that's where the big shine is. Yeah, our amygdala is us. When we build resilience, what we are doing is that we are building skills and strategies to build up that prefrontal cortex. So, you know, we learn things like how to create really good goals for ourselves, how to develop a very clear vision. Because when we do that, then we're moving forward. And I'll come back to that definition in a moment, the definition of resilience, because you actually asked me before and I didn't answer it, but we'll get to that. So the idea is that the more time we spend building the fitness of the cortex, so building that prefrontal cortex. So I want you to think when you are spending time building that prefrontal cortex, so problem solving, planning, being able to be really resourceful, having broader thinking, being more flexible with your thinking. When you start to build that, that's the connection. And what that does is that the stronger that is, the more it can quieten the amygdala, because it then becomes louder than the amygdala shout. And so then what the idea is to actually have them touching, not have the gap, but have them touching, because when they touch, your cortex is able to just quieten that down. It's able to hold it and keep it calm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really does. I was reflecting on one of the things I've always done with my kids is when they fall off the motorbike and their knees covered in blood or whatever, I'd make a point of not panicking, and I ask them, is this major, medium or minor? And I've framed up that if your arm's broken, that's a medium. And so...
What's major?
I can't tell you how often I've said, guys, major, medium or minor. They've said minor, and then I've just seen their whole physiology change. They might have fallen out of a tree or whatever. I remember once my son threw a pitchfork. He was practicing his javelin and it got one of my other sons in the eye. And again, I sort of said to them both major, medium or minor, and they both said medium. I was like, right, well, let's just work through this that way. And they both really settled down. So is there a question like that we can ask ourselves when we're feeling real stress and overwhelm that helps us keep perspective in that moment, which in and of itself might quieten the amygdala and allow the prefrontal cortex to
so there's
come into its own?
There are a series of questions. I have to say I actually really like yours. I'm going to borrow that if that's okay. I think that's fantastic. Is this mild, medium or major? What's a major for you? Because a pitchfork is sort of a bit major for me. What's major for you?
Major for me would be near death. One of my kids has looks like he's broken his neck or severely severed a leg or something. Like, I think, a broken arm for me is a medium, isn't it? But I think so often when the amygdala fires, we major the minors. And
we do. Absolutely do.
I think it's one thing to have your dad say, is that a medium or a minor? But I think we need to be able to ask questions like that of ourselves when we're in the heat of battle, so that we keep perspective and keep a sense of reality, so that we self-manage the amygdala.
Yeah. So what we're now talking about is composure. So we ask questions like, is this helpful? Does this thinking allow me to plan flexibly? Does my thinking allow me to be adaptive? Does this thinking allow me to feel better? So we've got to check our thinking. Yeah, we've got to listen. What is it that I'm actually saying? And then inquire about that. So I call it cognitive quality control. Nice. It's a little bit like, you're standing at a conveyor belt, and every box that's coming past, you're checking it. Yeah, you're checking the corners, you're checking whether it's, because what you want at the end is the high quality product. So I've got to do my job, and my job is to inquire and have some quality control over that thinking. So if you put a thought on a conveyor belt and you look at that thought and you say it out loud and you go, well, and then you inquire, and that's the inquiry process, and you go, well, is this thought helpful? Does it allow me to be productive? Does it allow me to be adaptive? Does this thought allow me to respond flexibly? Does this thought allow me to feel better about myself? Does this thought allow me to now think about how to move forward? And a great question that I love to ask people is, what would you say if a friend was thinking the same way as you? What would you say to them? How would you respond to a friend who is thinking like this? Because when you do that, you actually, what happens is we're asked to not reflect on ourselves, but we're asked to reflect on what someone else would be, you know, how would we respond to them if they were thinking like that? And you will immediately get a completely different answer. You know, if I walked around saying to myself, oh, I'm an idiot, I'm an idiot, I'm an idiot, and then someone said to me, well, how would you respond if your friend was saying that to you? And I go, well, if I had a good friend that was going around saying I'm an idiot, I'd be saying, no, you're not an idiot. You've actually got really good resources. In fact, there are so many good things about you that make you incredible. We would never talk to other people the way that we talk to ourselves, with such disdain, with such resentment, with such self-flagellation. And yet we allow it because we don't go in and check our thinking. So asking some of those questions just becomes really important.
That's a great comment. One of my mentors, Marshall Thurbert, shared this article with me about mastery. And if we want to be in pursuit of mastery in anything, one of the first things we have to do is have deep compassion for ourselves. Isn't it interesting that I can't be a professional golfer, I can't be a professional farmer, I can't pursue excellence in anything until I'm kind to myself.
Absolutely.
Yet we are our own harshest critic so often, aren't we? And to your point, we wouldn't ever say some of the things we say to ourselves about ourselves. We wouldn't make those assertions towards even our worst enemy, let alone a friend. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
So compassion for self. So what else do we need to know at a high level about how the mind works against or then in support of us being more resilient?
Yeah, so one of the areas that we talk about in resilience is what we call composure. And composure is our capacity to be able to regulate our bodies and our minds when they both become very loud. You know, when we move into states of really high distress, that hyperarousal where our heart's beating, our chest is tight, our throat's tight, our mouth goes really dry, we're chewing our jaw. You know, our legs feel like they're jelly, or that we want to run, or that sometimes we can feel really confused. That when we are experiencing those symptoms, it's really important to find ways to calm that noise and to soften that noise so that our prefrontal cortex can actually begin to think. You know, like, you know, it's that amygdala shout. So things like stopping and pausing, go and grab a water, go and grab a cup of tea, go for a walk. Movement seems to be picking up a huge amount of interest in research lately. They're calling it forward ambulation. And forward ambulation is this idea that we become far more responsive to our environment if we have some forward moving, and it's got to do with eye movement. We can go into it deeply, but let's just leave it like that at the moment. But if you go for a walk, a brisk walk, and you are holding yourself in care, you're being compassionate with yourself, you just say, look, I just need a break. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to go for a walk. I need some fresh air. Let me just go out. And that movement really allows you to use up that adrenaline that's in the body. But it also offers you opportunity to go to calm and just bring yourself down. There are breathing techniques that we can also engage in. And there are a number of breathing techniques that people talk about. You know, there's the box breathing, there's the +2 breathing. So there are a whole lot of strategies, and there are breath coaches out there that will talk about particular strategies. The idea is always just find it. Find your breath. Find it. You know, you go out and you can say, I'm just going to find my breath. And you find your breath where you move into this state where you can actually feel the gentle inhale coming through your nostrils. And then this release, and your shoulders are dropping. I keep saying to people, just find your breath, find it. And sometimes what can be really helpful is that forced exhale, where you force, and you force all the air out, and then suddenly you let go and you do this natural, and you go, well, there it is. That's the breath. There it is. It's really interesting because there's also been some interesting research about this concept called the physiological sigh. And the physiological sigh tends to have a reset effect on the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is this really important nerve that links the base of your brain to right down your spinal cord. And it belongs to the parasympathetic nervous system. I wish I had I've got a whiteboard, but you won't be able to see it if I draw it. But the physiological sigh is really interesting. What it does is that it rebalances the amount of carbon dioxide to the amount of oxygen that's in your system. Because when we're panicking, we're actually taking in far too much oxygen, and the body doesn't like heightened levels of oxygen. There needs to be a balance between oxygen and carbon dioxide, because what we're doing is we're doing this panic, so we're just gasping and we're just bringing in more oxygen, and the brain then goes into a panic and goes, no, there's too much oxygen. So the physiological sigh is really interesting. It's 2 quick succession breath intake. The second one sort of needs to be a bit longer than the first. There's a hold, and then there's just a, and when you go out, it's through pursed lips and you drop your shoulders at the same time. So it sort of looks like this. So it's a sigh. It's actually really powerful. You actually only need, well, look, the research, if you listen to sort of Dr. Andrew Huberman, who's one of my muses at the moment, I'm just obsessed with his work. He's a neuroscientist in the States. And Andrew Huberman has done a huge amount of work around the physiological sigh, and I would encourage you to go and find it and have a look, or I'm happy to send you the link. But he explains it beautifully, and I can tell you it is very, very powerful. So it's just a reset. And in fact, reset is one of my favourite words at the moment. We don't fix mental illness. We need to move away from that. We don't fix depression. We don't fix anxiety. That's not how the human body works. We're organic. We're not mechanically contrived or built. So we will always experience moments of being flat or moments of being heightened, and that's really important.
I think it's so true. And to your point right at the outset, we're going to have situations thrown at us in life that challenge us, and resilience is how we adapt and respond. But we need to be careful with these labels, but also we've got to be okay living with the conditions and being able to take them on and self-regulate and self-manage. And so I love you sharing with us how to find calmness, how to find composure, and using that breath work as an example to self-regulate so that we can, come back to a situation and work through it constructively.
But, Jeremy, can I just say what's even more important than self-regulation is co-regulation.
So what's the difference?
Oh. The difference is that when I find somebody who can hold my space and just be with me, neurologically, you very, very quickly feel held, feel safe, feel secure, and you can go to a much more balanced state far more quickly. The idea of co-regulation is that when I'm resilient and you come to me and you've been dysregulated for some reason, or you're a bit heightened or something, if I can remain really anchored and remain very present for you neurologically, there's a neurological bounce that happens. And because I can remain so stable for you, you're going to feel that neurologically, and you are more likely to go back to balance. There is nothing more powerful than a hug. There is nothing more powerful than a shoulder rub. There is nothing more powerful than holding someone's hand and going, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere until you tell me you're just better. There is nothing more powerful than having someone stand in front of you and not mirror your distress, but hold you in care. Just give you that space, hold that space for you. And so co-regulation, we're beginning to see our research talk about that neurological states can mimic each other very, very quickly. And so when you have someone who's calm and regulated and is really well anchored, and that is that person for you, you've got someone to go to. And so now what we're talking about, Jeremy, are communities of care. When we train people in resilience and we train a number of people, suddenly we've got this massive paradigm shift, because when you're okay and I'm okay and she's okay and he's okay, and we know how to be okay, because we're not always going to be okay. But when you've got the resources there and you move into that space, and I might ring you and I'll go, Jeremy, today I've had a really crap day and I've got to tell you what's happened. And I know you are my co-regulator. And you say to me, Maria, I'm listening. I'm going to pop open a beer. I'm going to go sit on my balcony. I'm going to put my legs up, but I've got you on the phone. I'm listening. Talk to me. I'm here for you. That is really powerful co-regulation. You've had a hard day out. You go back to your wife at the end of the day, and she's slamming plates and she's throwing pots, and the kids and things haven't gone right. She's burnt the butter. And you've walked in. You've had a hard day too, but you can see she's not regulated, and you just walk up to her and you say to her, I'm really happy to be home. And I'm happy to be here. Tell me what I can do for you. Do we need 5 minutes? I'm not going anywhere. That in itself is very, very powerful, because the butter is minor, but when you're distressed, the butter's major. We turn the minor into a major, exactly like what you've said. But when you've got someone to co-regulate with, suddenly you don't feel so abandoned, but you feel so connected. And it's that connectedness that creates co-regulation. Very, very powerful.
I think that really speaks to the really important leadership role that we each play in family business, and in community. I think it's rarely talked about, that concept of holding space for someone else. But if you can be calm, or if I can be calm and composed and be there for people in my team, in my family and community, it's such an important leadership role. I'm so lucky to have a spiritual guide and my coach in Dig, who I spend about an hour and a half or 2 hours with him every week, and he just holds space for me to explore and reflect, and having that is priceless. And so worthwhile just for our listeners to check in on that. Who do you have holding space for you, that you can check in and explore some of the things that we're talking about?
Yeah. And the other question, Jeremy, is who do you hold space for? So not only who holds your space, who co-regulates you, who is the person that you help to co-regulate? Because we know what that feels like when we are being co-regulated, when we're being held, when we're being connected, but then take that and then go, now who am I going to hold space for? Who needs my co-regulation? And can you see how we're just passing it forward? Whatever we're getting here, we're not keeping it to ourselves. We go, now how can I do this for someone else? Yeah. And we create communities of care, and that's really important. But what's even more important here, so let's now go to the definition really quickly, because we've spent, all this time sort of hovering around it. So the definition that we use in our neuroscience model is we define resilience as advancing despite adversity. 3 words, but very, very powerful. And that those words are inviting a very broad perspective. When I was listening to your podcast, you were talking about epicomia. And epicomia is the process that occurs when there is a bushfire and trees are burnt to a crisp. Yeah, everything's just black. And then you wait a couple of months, and those burnt sort of shells around the tree, they fall off, and you've got new sprouts forming. That's epicomia. Now, resilience is not being in the fire. Yeah. Resilience is not that you avoid the fire. Resilience is about knowing how hard it is to be burnt and being very present in knowing what that experience is like. See, resilience is not something that feels good. I think we need to be really clear with people. When you are being resilient, when you are in an active, immediate state of being resilient, it's not going to feel nice. What feels nice is that you've been able to move through it and look back and go, gee, I was resilient then, but then didn't feel good. So it's this idea that you do experience the distress, you do experience the burn, you do experience. Resilient people don't avoid that. They experience the adversity, but you advance despite of it. And it means this idea, again, to forward ambulation, is that you've got to continue to move forward. Because if you move back, it's depression. And if you jump forward, then that's anxiety, because then you expect the worst. So advancing despite adversity means that you are impacted by the adversity, you are impacted by the challenge, but you don't identify with it as you move forward. You start to peel it off and go, right, now what are the resources? Who am I underneath all of this, and how now do I come through this? And there are ways of doing that.
I love that. Incredible. Thank you. And we don't always have to feel good in that process. I love that. So, Maria, would you mind speaking to the program that you've created, Resilience First Aid? I'm keen that our listeners understand that, and absolutely I want to share a link to that so that if people want to explore that as an opportunity for them, that they have the ability to. Can you just speak to your program?
Yeah. So I've helped co-design it. So the organisation behind Resilience First Aid is Driven, and they're in Sydney. And Yuri Russo is the director of that. And I've been so fortunate to be asked to come in and help co-design the program. And the program is based on the PR6, and the PR6 is a resilience model, and it's based on neuroscience. So the PR6 stands for Predictive Resilience Factor 6, and 6 means that there are 6 domains to resilience. And the PR6 talks about these 6 domains, which we teach in Resilience First Aid. So it's a 2-day certification course. And what we do is that we spend 2 entire days going through each of those 6 domains in detail with the neuroscience behind it. And there's lots of neuroscience. But as you know, Jeremy, the neuroscience behind it is important because it just gives us a framework to work with. It doesn't mean that we're teaching an exact science. But what we're doing is that we're giving people enough information so that they can understand what's happening inside, and they can begin to visualize what needs to happen. You know, it's that connection. So we explore the 6 domains, and the 6 domains are vision, So we talk about creating goals, we talk about goal planning, we talk about our purpose, our values, all the things that you spoke about in your podcast so beautifully. And that we spend time looking at why that is. And just for your interest, the area when we spend time focusing on vision, and we really give that our attention, what we're doing is that we are increasing the strength of the reticular activating system. So each section, each of the domains have particular neural areas that activate when you are employing this particular domain. And the idea is that if you are employing all of the 6 domains, then what you're doing is that you are creating really strong mental fitness, because you are activating a whole lot of areas neurologically in the brain so that it all becomes switched on. So you've got a really strong cortex to quieten the amygdala. Composure is about regulation. It's about emotional awareness. Now, this is a very, very big domain, because this is where we teach how to calm, how to manage our stress levels. Here is where we are taught how to, what the breathing does, what happens in the lungs, how to self-regulate, and why that's important for our thinking brain. The next one is reasoning, and reasoning you will particularly like, because reasoning talks about the thinking traps, which is the cognitive distortions, and it talks about what we can do instead. How do we inquire? The purpose of being able to identify our resources and how resourceful we can be and how well we can adapt. So talking about coping. Then there's health. This is a very interesting domain, because most resilient measures really don't look at health. But if we're not looking after the health of our bodies and the health of our brains, then there's no point even talking about how resilient we can be, because if we're not sleeping well, and if we're not eating well, and if we're not exercising, if we're not moving, then the rest of it doesn't really happen for us, because, we deteriorate our physical resources and we end up in a chair and, and being immobile. So looking after our sleep quality and our exercise habits are critical. So we focus on that. The next domain is tenacity. And tenacity is our ability to focus attention, to look at optimism and the role that optimism, that hopeful thinking, what that does for us, and how we have forward thinking and forward moving in our thinking, so that we are constantly building this level of tenacity where we raise our level of motivation, where we continue to persevere and persist. And then the last domain, which I have to say is my favourite, which is collaboration. And collaboration is very, very much about co-regulation, connecting. How do we connect with people? How do we reach out? How do we build social confidence? How do we build a social capital in our life so that we are able to bring people on board, hold people's spaces, but also allow other people to hold our space when necessary? And when we put all of those domains together, we have advancing despite adversity. That's where we learn how to do that advancing and how we learn to move through the adversity.
Thank you for sharing that. And I love that there is a program dedicated to helping people work through those 6 key pillars, if you like, of being resilient and supporting. I think once you've done that training, you can also then be confident enough to support others to go on that journey as well. So, yeah, that program, am I right? It's as much for helping others in this space as it is helping.
Oh, absolutely. So we teach you how to become a resilient responder. So you become part of the responder community. So you not only do you also happen to be learning about resilience yourself, but the idea is to learn the skills of resilience so that you can help other people develop theirs. You become a resilience first aid responder. So you go to people's aid, hold their space, and know what to say, how to say it, know where to direct their attention, know what the functional features of resilience are. And, learning the neuroscience means that we align ourselves with this idea that it's biology before behaviour. we don't just focus on behavior, we actually focus on the biology of what resilience and mental health looks like.
Perfect, Maria. Thank you. I've got 3 more questions for you. And before I ask these, if it's okay, let's do another podcast on cognitive distortions. I think it would be incredible. I'd love to allow our members, our listeners, to kind of reflect more fully on each of those key cognitive distortions, if that's okay.
I would absolutely love to, yeah.
So if it's okay, my last 3 questions, I'll give them all to you, and you feel free just to answer them in any way you can. So I'd love just to touch on the science of optimism and what research there is out there on the importance of optimism. Equally, the importance and any research around the importance of gratitude in helping people maintain perspective and live a resilient life. And then my last question is just a final tip for our listeners on what you would have them do on this journey. Where do they start? What do they do to explore this and that topic of resilience perhaps a little more fully?
Nice. Yep. So the science of optimism is enormous. And the role that optimism plays in our mindset as well as our neurological landscape is that it offers what we call the positivity offset. So when we are in spaces where we are not coping, where we have heightened negativity, where our attention is all on all the things that are going wrong, there is this concept that we call the offset. So what research, has found is that if you go in and try and just work with changing all the negatives and trying to turn them all into positives, it's really ineffective, because the reality is that there are some things in our lives, some ways of thinking that are negative that is really important. Things around checking for safety and things around, what are the dangers? So you can't turn them all into. But if we hold those realistic negatives in place and then we introduce some positives, it becomes an offset. So rather than our life being like this, where we're really focused on negatives and we're feeling really crap about ourselves all the time, because when we think that, we feel that, and our positive life is down here, to offset and to bring that back to balance is that we start to engage in, on purpose, by the way, we start to engage with strategies that allow this balance to come back up, that allow what we call the positivity offset. And what that does is that we engage in things like keeping a gratitude journal, or that we come to the end of the day and we talk to our family about what went well during the day, or that we, on purpose during the day, we notice things that happen, and they're small things, small things that happen, that you stop and pause and stay in that pause, and you just go, that actually was really nice. So, things like I might be parking the car at a supermarket, I open the door and I find a $2 coin on the ground. And rather than just going, oh, yeah, $2, this is great, you pick it up and you flick it in the car, you stop and you look at the $2, you pick it up and you go, this was meant for me. And this is actually really nice. And now with this $2, I'm actually going to do something with it that aligns with my value. I'm going to do something with it that aligns with my priority. So you don't just become flippant about good things that happen. You actually stay with it and you align with it and you go, this is good for me. This is nice. This is nice that this has happened. Why has it happened? I don't know. I just found it. Or that you might be lining up for a coffee and you've got someone behind you who's really grumpy because the line's too long, they want a coffee. And then what you do is you turn around and you just give a smile and you go, you know what? The line's long, but I know that there's a good coffee ahead. We just take small things and we connect in positive ways. And what optimism does is that it begins to train that aperture, that we start to allow that aperture to begin to focus on the things that are healthy and helpful for us, rather than just constantly narrowing in and focusing on the things that are unhelpful. And so the science of optimism is so critical for holding hope, for being able to create realistic goals forward, to lift our level of motivation so that we're not starting from this zero ground all the time, but we're leveraged a lot sooner. So that optimism plays a very, very crucial part in also helping us to strengthen our prefrontal cortex. And the last part of your question, which I now have forgotten, was?
Well, you've touched on gratitude, and I think it does link in with optimism, doesn't it? So just the importance of gratitude.
It's critically important, because what it does is that it allows us to be reflective of the good things that have happened in our lives, but also who's contributed to that. And it motivates us to want to replicate that and pay it forward. And again, we fall back into, creating these amazing, compassionate and wonderful communities of care.
Go on.
Sorry, I just want to leave you with a quote. I was so privileged a number of years ago to be doing some work alongside Professor Christopher Peterson. And I spent about 3 or 4 days with him and just looking at some of his research. And he was a huge man from America, and he had this, he was huge. He was like this big Texan, and he wore a Texan hat, and he wasn't from Texas at all, but he just loved the hats, and, and he was this, and he was huge. And yet when he spoke, he was a gentle giant. But I remember one of the things that he kept saying over and over again, and I gift this forward to people that I work with, and his quote that he has left with me in my heart and in my mind. And I remember him saying to me, Maria, out of all of the research that we have done over the years, what we keep finding and what we keep going back to is a simple statement of other people matter. And they do. They matter in our lives. Other people matter in our health. Other people matter in our vision, in the way that we compose ourselves. Other people matter when we are checking in with them and checking to see how we think. Other people matter in why we persist and persevere. So the people that we have around us, that we keep in our circle, they matter to us. And it is because we live in communities where we have belonging and we have identity with other people that our life becomes so purposeful. So other people matter.
I love that. And what a perfect way to finish. I find when I'm off my game and not on my A game, if I reflect on where my focus is, I'm being very self-centered and self-focused and, caught up in my own thoughts and what's not going okay for me. But one of my self-corrections now is to turn my attention back to being in the service of others. And when I do that, I find that everything changes in my psychology, and that's one of the key things that helps me self-correct. So I think it's a nice way to finish that if we're not feeling okay, look how you can reach out and care for someone else, and maybe just the doing of that can help you on your path to resilience and improvement. Now, Maria, we've scratched the surface on so many topics, and I can certainly see why this is your lifetime's work. I can't wait to connect with you again. But, on behalf of our community, I genuinely want to thank you for your time with our alumni members. We've had such amazing feedback. And I know that the conversation we've just had has touched quite a few people in our community. And I'm really grateful for that, but look forward to connecting again on all things cognitive distortions. Thank you so much for today. And thank you so much for giving us an insight into the neuroscience of how the mind works in and around this important topic of resilience.
Well, I look forward to sharing even more information, but I very much look forward to, we have a November date for Resilience First Aid. So if people would love to come to Melbourne, Windy Hill, if anyone barracks for Essendon, but come down and spend 2 days with us and receive a certification. And and share some of this wonderful learning. But I really look forward to speaking with you again, Jeremy. Thank you so much.
Maria, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.
And so there you have it, ladies and gents. Quite an incredible woman in Maria Ruberto, 30 years clinically trained in psychology, but to be able to explore this important topic of resilience and to explore and understand, or even start to understand, the neuroscience and how the mind works, and how we can self-manage and self-regulate and support each other to be more resilient. I'm just really grateful to have had that conversation with Maria, and we'll look for ways to continue to have her involved in Profitable Farmer, and we'll tap into her knowledge on a few other topics in the future. I hope that's been really useful for you. And as we said at the start, if this has triggered anything for you that you feel like you need more support on, in the written intro to this podcast, we'll share some numbers that you can call for more support. Thank you for listening once again, and take care. Bye for now. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Profitable Farmer podcast by Farm Owners Academy. If you're new to this show, be sure to follow us. If you've been a long-time listener, let your friends know about us, or come continue the conversation in the Profitable Farmer Facebook group. All the best as you grow your business and create your freedom farm. Until next time, keep being incredible.